all of our tools, all the tools of science can find something like 3, 4, 5% of reality. 95% of it, 96% of reality, 97% of reality, we can't find to look at. Our tools, I would suggest, are in the wrong octave. Like a piano keyboard, you've got low C and C and high C and high C. I would suggest that it's possible that there are octaves of frequency of reality, and that if we're looking on the physical plane with physical plane tools, we're only going to find the physical plane, and we need to use our tools which can perceive the higher planes, the higher octaves, if we want to find the rest of reality. I think it was Jesus that said that the body is the temple. People heard about this one? Is that a fair quote? The body is a temple?
Yeah.
The temple is a place where you go to pray, to commune to the divine, with the divine, right? If the body is the place where you go to commune with the divine, I would suggest that your body is the tool that can perceive the higher octaves of reality. And if your body is so dissonant, is so out of tune, that it can't hold the higher octaves, then it becomes very difficult for us to actually commune and operate from that higher level. So that's the basic point I want to make, is that this work of growing good food and eating good food can be framed from the perspective of we're solving global warming through carbon sequestration. It can be framed through we're obviating the need for agribusiness through growing healthy plants. It can be framed that we're helping the ecosystem by not polluting the aquifers and the waterways. It can be framed that we're helping with national security by preventing the national debt from becoming overwhelming because we're minimizing the healthcare costs. We can also be framed that we're doing God's work in helping people become more attuned to their higher natures. So what's exciting to me is that this food movement, which seems to be burgeoning, which seems to be really just sort of on all fronts, people are coming around to this question of food, and it's for all these different reasons. We can use this food movement to help bring about all these different objectives. So that's really the central objective that I've got, and I just feel like I want to share it. So there I have. You can take it for whatever you like. Yes.
I wonder if you've given enough thought to the power of the mind to affect and change the chemistry of our bodies.
Yes. There's no question that our mind, as far as I'm concerned, our mind is operating from a higher frequency. And if you can maintain coherence in your mind, you certainly can affect reality on the physical plane. That's how Jesus did his miracles and everybody else, I think, because they had the coherence in the higher octave. The question is, how much control do you have of your mind? The question is, how powerful is your mind? And I think most of us would have to be honest about the fact that our minds are not very coherent, that we can't control our minds, that we can't fix and focus our minds. Some of us can, to some decent degree, but my understanding is that we're embarrassingly rudimentary in our capacities. There was a teacher that I have who, one of his aphorisms is, environment is stronger than willpower. Environment is stronger than willpower. And I would consider that our environment is our body, and that is stronger than our willpower of our mind to create reality. And I'm not saying one is stronger than the other, but my experience has been that I may intend well and mean well, but based on the circumstances around me, I will eventually sort of come into tune with them. And so from a strategic standpoint, I think that eating good food and building a body that's more coherent will simply help the mind become more powerful, and the will and everything else become more powerful. I don't know. I just think it's probably not a bad idea.
From my background, I think there's probably 98 or 99% of what you say I can fly with.
That's enough.
One more. One more.
Afterwards, we'll talk about what the 1% is. I'd love to hear it.
One more item. Jesus describes what he calls the heart, and out of the heart perceives the issues of life. And it occurs to me, after years and years of contemplation, that the heart is nothing much more than accumulation of our loves and hates. And it is the heart that drives the emotions. And it is the heart that is the furthest out of reach of our ability to intentionally change ourselves.
I'm not sure I would agree with that, but I would love to have a deeper conversation with you. Yes. I'm going to hold the conversation personal till later. So the rest of the handout here is what I call the seminal thinkers, and I unfortunately have not a hell of a lot of time to go into them all. So with as much depth as they deserve, I'll go quickly, and I have touched on some of them earlier. Mei Wan Ho, a woman of, I believe, Chinese descent, currently operating in the peak of her career in Great Britain, founder of the organization, the Institute of Science and Society. Really, really interesting individual. Among other things, has coined this term quantum jazz. She also has written a really good book about water, by the way. I think it's called The Rainbow and the Worm. But quantum jazz is her understanding of what goes on inside living cells as far as vibrations of compounds. And effectively what she says is that every time a new compound enters a cell with its vibration, every other compound in that cell, which is vibrating at this speed, which is 1 times 10 to the negative 14th of a second, which is pretty fast.
Yeah.
Every single other compound in that cell modulates its vibration like a jazz band to be in tune with that new element or compound coming into the cell. There's this constant modulation of vibration that's going on at this exquisite speed. This is actually how living systems operate. This is where biochemistry and biophysics become different from chemistry and physics. Biochemistry and biophysics operate differently, and a lot of our physics that we've studied has not been in living systems. It's been this sort of straight abiotic physics. It's really quite interesting, the nuances of what's going on and the feedback loops. This helps me understand perhaps how the effect of me sitting and meditating in front of a zucchini plant has caused its leaves to expand dramatically overnight. Like how applying a foliar spray has caused 6 inches of new growth on every stem, on every plant, in 3 days, with green leaves and bright flowers on plants that were almost dead. I have seen things occur on the physical plane through the application of small amounts of material or intention that have violated my understandings of what's possible. Absolutely violated my experience, my understanding. I've seen it happen with my own eyes, and what she talks about, the science of how things work in living systems, maybe is a window into how these things go on. Phil Callahan, recently departed, was a entomologist at the University of Florida in his professional career. As an entomologist, someone who studies insects, all of his work is classified by the U.S. military, which means we can't see it. One might ask why somebody who studies insects has their work classified, and the answer is because he was studying the antenna of insects. And the antenna of insects and how life has designed antenna is a very interesting question, and the military knows about studying nature and learning from nature. They understand that nature has already figured a lot of things out, and biomimicry is a really good idea. Phil Callahan, after he retired, was able to publish a couple of books where he would lay out thought experiments which conveyed some of the things that he was able to study but not able to publish. A couple of them I want to just quickly convey here. One of them talks about this whole question of pheromones. I'm sure people have heard about pheromones and how the female insect is flying through the night sky, and she emits a pheromone, and the male insect from 2 miles away smells her and finds her, and they get to do what they do. One might ask, how much pheromone, which is basically a perfume, a female insect might emit in a night, and how strong the cloud must be for a male insect 2 miles away with no nose to smell it. Because insects don't really have very well developed noses, and a 4-mile wide diameter of aroma is a pretty significant amount of material for a small little insect to be emitting. And Phil Callahan said, silly people, always anthropomorphizing. Don't you understand? What insects have that is highly developed is not a nose, but an antenna system. And that compound in chemistry is a vibration in physics. And his antennae are tuned to the frequency of that compound. And all he's doing is hearing 88.5 coming in stronger from this direction than this direction and flying in this direction. It's really, really simple. And the only way, and you can test it by taking a male insect and putting it in one room and a female insect and putting it in the other room and seeing whether he flies towards her or not through the wall. Right? Can he smell her through the wall? Yes, he can. Because he's not smelling her, he's hearing her.
We've been finding bed bugs on this same issue with pheromones, happily not at my house.
Yeah. Very interesting man, Phil Callahan. This explains to me why it was that as a child I would see when the potatoes germinated, when we had rotated them across the street 1,000 feet away from where they were last year, that up an inch and a half, all the potato bugs on the property were right on the potato plants. Right? Rotations are supposed to deal with this. I grew up on a farm. I noticed things. I noticed that I didn't see potato bugs anywhere else in the farm except where the potatoes were germinating 1,000 feet away from where we planted them last year. They were right there. According to Phil Callahan, minor tangent. In the olden days, maybe I had one of these in their house.
Yes.
Ever see one of those? It's not very well drawn. You get the gist? This is a thing on the physical plane, but it's actually vibrating, and the compounds that are in it, if it's full of nitrates, it's vibrating the frequency of a potato leaf full of nitrate. If it's full of protein, it's vibrating the frequency of a potato leaf full of protein. Guess which one the potato bug's antenna are tuned to? A potato leaf full of nitrate. That's the frequency their antenna are tuned to. It, according to Callahan, looks like neon light. Everything else is static, and that's neon light.
Yeah.
According to Phil Callahan, he tracked how it works into their brains and the synapses all the way through. Nature's communicating through vibration whether we like it or not. Right? And this is what the indigenous communities are telling us, is that the plants speak to us, and they're using speak, in a metaphorical. It's not like there's actual words, except depending on how sophisticated your antenna system are, it may come through to you as words, which moves us right along here. In a minute, we'll get there.
Just add one real quick thing.
Yes.
There's a number of different stuff you can read in the philosophy of language, and a lot of people working on the intersection of like animality studies or critical animal studies and language. And one quick difference is the difference between speech and language. And so a speech act doesn't, the speech act I'm engaged in right now relies upon a shared grammar that I have with you. And we all have shared grammars with other animals that don't speak English.
Mm-hmm.
So your dog might not understand the word sit, but it understands a certain kind of tonality and a grammar that's very physiological and relies upon vibrations. And so people are taking this to the extent where they're now engaging with interspecies communication, this relationship to plants, where they're extending
Absolutely.
this philosophy into that direction.
It's quite exciting. I'll get to Buhner in a second. And I've got Kervin along the way. Louis Kervin, I think I referred to him yesterday. I talked about transmutation to some small degree. Louis Kervin, member of the French Academy of Science. I'll just give you a quick review of him. I don't have time for the full commentary. He began his professional career as working in what was then called French Algeria in the oil fields, which is now called Algeria. This is the colonial period. His job was to monitor the oil workers, the black Africans who were working in the oil fields in the extreme conditions of 120 degrees temperatures, et cetera, to make sure that they didn't drop dead, because it's bad economics to have your workers die on you. So his job was to monitor them and make sure that they are maintaining hydration and all these basic levels so they could stay alive and keep working. And a part of what his job included was actually ashing all of the food that they were taking in and all of the excrement that was coming out of their bodies, to monitor what was coming in, what was going out, what the balances were, imbalances, etc. And as he was doing this work, he noticed that there seemed to be, I think it was more potassium going into their bodies than leaving their bodies, and more sodium coming out than going in. And potassium and sodium are electrolytes, and they're critical electrolytes. They need to be maintained at very specific levels in your blood for you to be, alive and function. And the imbalance was not large, but it was there, and it continued day after day as he continued this monitoring. At some point, he alerted his higher-ups, and they decided that it was potentially an issue because it had been going on for a couple of weeks now. It was extreme temperatures. Maybe something was going on. We didn't know what it was. Couldn't figure it out. Started, chopping them open and looking for the potassium deposits and where the sodium deficits were, because they're black and it's okay. And, this is science. Couldn't find the potassium deposits. Couldn't find the sodium deficits. Sewed them back up again. Process continued. The science kept telling them, the data kept telling them as they were ashing what was going in and what was going out, that there was more potassium going in and going out, and more sodium coming out than going in. Finally, Kervran did his math a little bit differently. He didn't do the elemental analysis, he did the atomic weight analysis. And interestingly, there were as many atomic weights coming in as going out. They were just coming in one elemental form and leaving in a different elemental form. And Kervran was actually a scientist. He let his data guide him, as opposed to letting his judgments and assumptions guide him, and said, well, data seems to be telling us this. This is very intriguing, and went on to have a very full career looking at other research from other countries and other people on other areas who were finding this very similar result, that in biological systems, as monitored, there seemed to be a shifting of atomic structure. There's various research that's out there people may or may not have heard of. There's the simple experiment you can do with fertilized chicken eggs. You can do take 24 fertilized chicken eggs and ash 12 of them and get a mineral spectra as your baseline, and then incubate the other 12 for 21 days. And if you can bring yourself to, you can ash those 12 eggs that are about to hatch and get a mineral spectra on them. And you'll find there's significantly more calcium in those incubated eggs than there were in the simply fertilized eggs. We know about taking calcium out of a chicken's diet, and as long as they've got access to mica, they'll keep having shells on their eggs. But you take the mica away, and the calcium on the shells disappears. They'll just have the skin. There's no calcium in mica, but as long as you keep the mica in their diet, they'll continue to have shells. There's all kinds of data about this. It's really, really interesting. This actually explains, if you read his book, Biological Transmutations, the issue of isotopes. I'm not sure anybody has ever wondered about isotopes. There's carbon-12 and there's carbon-14. Some carbon waste has 14 atomic weights and some has 12. What's going on here? Why? Right? Well, because when they were making potassium out of, sulfur, he lays it all out. It's very, very intriguing. It's very, very intriguing. But apparently, this only happens with biological systems. This does not happen in nature, in like abiotic systems. It doesn't happen in test tubes. We haven't found it in test tubes, so we don't think it's possible. And yet, our scientific tools can show us that this is happening. But because we haven't been able to do it, we think it must be flawed data. Very, very interesting. We have an annual conference for the BFA every year. And a couple of years ago, I was speaking, and we had brought in various speakers to cover different topics, and I was sort of batting cleanup, and what were topics that hadn't been covered yet, and I was like, I'll cover those ones, and so no one else had covered transmutation. People are afraid to talk about this for some silly reason, and so I went out and gave my little shtick on transmutation, and afterwards, a young woman who was working on a farm, a local farm to where the conference was being held, came up to me and said, Dan, a lot of the things you guys are talking about makes a lot of sense to me, but when you start talking about things like that, I have to throw out everything you've said because I know this isn't true. And I said, have you bothered to do a Google search on transmutation? She said, no, it's not true. I said, well, before we continue this conversation, why don't you go home tonight and just type in biological transmutation and get back to me on what you find. And she came back to me the next morning and said the first thing that came up when I typed in biological transmutation was U.S. military research on biological transmutation. I had no idea. I said, that's the whole point. We don't have any idea. It's not in our school. It's not in our media. The science is there. The proper Western science is there to say things are going on we don't understand. This, as I understand it, is how bioaccumulator plants work. Bioaccumulator plants are actually making elements that are not present necessarily in the subsoil. We say, well, they got deep roots, and so therefore must be pulling it up from somewhere. Maybe, maybe not. I gave you the example of the nettles yesterday and the boron. How does it all work? I don't know. Is it? The data seem to tell us it is true. I would suggest this is how nature balances soils. This is how you start with entirely different basic subsoils, entirely different basic parent materials, and you end up with very similar topsoils across the planet. This is how it happens, I would suggest, is through biological activity. They're actually manufacturing this stuff.
It seems like part of our blindness is because of our philosophical basis in Greek thought that discards anything that might be called subjective.
Yeah,
We only want objective reality.
Yes.
We cannot tolerate subjective reality.
yeah,
And all of these things are in that class that the Greeks thought were voodoo or something. I don't know what they thought it was.
Yes.
They would not allow it. And so this has come through German reasoning. This has come into America in our philosophical schools.
it's really interesting where exactly the blind spots are and what causes them. I don't quite understand it. That may be a logical philosophical position. Yeah,
It's an underpinning of our whole scholasticism.
yeah,
All of our educational theories are based in that Greek thought.
yeah. And we can see the effect that that thought is having on the planet around us and, our communities and our culture. At any rate, I would like to continue because I am definitely running out of time. Lynn McTaggart is a investigative journalist. She wrote a book called The Field. I think it was a little while ago now, in the late 90s, I believe. There's a couple more since then called The Intention Experiment and a few others. But I have told the story. I have an interesting situation in my personal life where I have 3 cousins that are PhD neuroscientists. That is, people that study the brain. Well, only one of them comes for Thanksgiving. The other 2 are from the Midwest. But when Audrey comes every year, I ask her about, because the Lynn McTaggart is, the book, The Field, is about cutting-edge insights in neuroscience. I so asked my cousin Audrey, who was a PhD neuroscientist, have you guys found memories yet? And she has to answer every year, no, we haven't. People may not be aware of this, but neuroscientists have been trying to find memory for a long time and they haven't found it yet. They have identified which parts of the brain are active when memories are occurring, but when they start chopping open the brain to figure out where the memories are and how they're stored, they're not there. Certain parts of the brain activate, but the memories are not stored in the brain like we have memories stored in a computer hard drive. What the cutting-edge neuroscientists seem to be saying, according to this book, is that they are stored in the field. And what is actually the field? Steiner of biodynamics referred to it as the Akashic record, which is a Sanskrit term. But just let me explain to you as a basic conceptual framework here. If there was a pool of still water and I threw a rock into it, and any one of you came around the corner 5 seconds later and looked at the pool, you would be able to see what happened even though you didn't see it happen, because you would have been able to see the waves that were caused by the thing that happened. And that's basically, as I understand it, effectively what the field is the field is all the waves that have occurred because of what has happened. And our brains are functionally not storing information, but they are antennae that are reading the field. This is what she's telling us in this work, which segues very nicely, as I understand it, into Buhner's work, Stephen Harrod Buhner's work about our antenna systems. Functionally, the antenna in our brain are these neurons. Our neurons are these very long filamentous-like structures which, pulse and turn and contract. And what Buhner is telling us is that actually our bodies are full of multiple organs that are full of these neurons. It's not just our head that is a brain. Actually, technically, interestingly, we have multiple organs full of that are full of neurons. Our heart is full of neurons. Our gut is full of neurons. And women have a 4th brain. Let me know what it is.
No.
What's that? No, you literally have a fourth organ full of neurons. The uterus.